Hey guys, this video is for my juniors for APUS. Remember to watch this video from start to finish. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the second New Deal. Now, remember the New Deal was focused around the three R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And for the first 2 years, the focus was on the two R's, relief and recovery. But the second New Deal was focused on more on the reform part, even though there was still a lot of relief and recovery to do. After FDR and the Democrats actually, well, the Democratic Party under FDR's leadership actually won an overwhelming victory in the 1934 congressional elections, with the Democrats taking over 2/3 of the seats in both the House and the Senate. Roosevelt felt empowered to go even bolder and become even more liberal. Now, there was more focus on the poor in and improving life for the poor in the second New Deal. And in his State of the Union address in 1935, FDR focused on three goals: expanding public works jobs, because there's still a lot of unemployment; assistance for the rural poor; support for unions; benefits for retired workers; and tougher business regulation. So that's five, I guess, right? One, two, yeah. Um, so those were the goals that FDR focused on, and would actually use that like as his North Star throughout the second part of his first term. Oh, and higher taxes on the wealthy. That's the sixth goal. Now, FDR made a major emphasis on improving living conditions for all sections of the country, including the South and the West. And the thing is that we talked about this in the previous video, but FDR really made a concerted effort to try to bring jobs to the South, improve living conditions in the South. Because the South had been a neglected part of the country for decades. Even years before the Great Depression, nobody really cared about the South. It was kind of left to wither. So FDR really focused a lot of federal dollars and attention on the South. Now, in April 1935, one of the most important of all the New Deal agencies was created. It was called the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration. It was run by Harry Hopkins, who was FDR's man for all seasons, the guy who kind of had FDR's back and ran almost everything for him into the war years. And the WPA was focused on providing directly jobs, public works jobs, to the unemployed. And ultimately, the WPA employed 8 million people. And I'm going to show you the map in our live class tomorrow. I'm going to show you all those WPA projects and New Deal projects in general throughout the country. It was an amazing thing. My own great grandfather, Newman Leibowitz, actually worked for the WPA. He was a cabinet maker, but he owned a restaurant which went out of business because of the Depression. And then he got a job working at Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx as part of the WPA. So he did some work at the hospital. He drove a truck. So that's my own great grandfather. So the thing is that millions and millions of other Americans also were saved from ruin by actually taking these public works jobs under the WPA and also the PWA, which had been established earlier. And the WPA basically built up this country again. Rebuilding our infrastructure, making enormous contributions to American cultural life as well, which we'll talk about in a minute. So it was an amazing record of achievement. A lot of New York was actually built by the WPA. The airports in New York, Kennedy Airport, which was then called Idlewild Airport, was actually a WPA project. And we could go on all day. And we will. I'll show you when I show you the map on Thursday. WPA projects took place in every corner of this country. It was absolutely amazing, building post offices and reservoirs and public buildings. Particularly noteworthy was the fact that the WPA actually hired unemployed writers and artists, who are really are one of the first groups to actually suffer in times of economic distress. And so artists were actually hired by the WPA to paint murals on government buildings. My old high school, where I used to teach before American Studies, and where I went when I was a teenager, DeWitt Clinton High School, in the Bronx. the entire like center of the third floor has this beautiful, beautiful mural that was actually painted by WPA artists. I used to take the kids actually to go see it. When we did this lesson. Even though I heard like a few years ago that painters spoiled it by dripping blue paint all over this mural, which was actually considered a New York City landmark, which was terrible. But artists did work throughout the country, working for the WPA. The Federal Writers Project actually hired writers to document immigrant life, to be city guides, and most famously slave recollections, which I actually studied quite extensively when I was in school, where writers were actually hired to actually go down south and interview former slaves, those who were still alive. It's been 70 years since emancipation, but a lot of the documentary evidence we have about slavery comes from the Federal Writers Project, where you know unemployed writers working for the government went to go interview former slaves. It's still an important source uh, for scholars of slavery. So the WPA Music Project, free concerts were actually given by unemployed musicians to provide some jobs and also a source of recreation for the population. Those murals were painted in a lot of post offices and schools and public buildings. Plays were put on by unemployed actors working for the WPA. So it's amazing. Like literally, FDR left no stone unturned to trying to deal with so many different areas of unemployment throughout the country by putting people to work, providing for needs that people had that maybe people weren't even thinking about. Right? Sometimes we don't think about art and music and plays in times of economic emergency, but just because things were so bad doesn't mean that people didn't need some sort of diversion, right? While at the same time providing jobs. The WPA was a wonderful agency. As my great grandfather could attest, he actually worked for them up until the 1940s, until he retired. Now, the National Youth Administration was the NYA. It actually set up job training and part-time jobs for young people. This was a pet project for Eleanor Roosevelt. She really, liked to work with young people and, tried to give young people who often had the hardest time finding jobs, because older people cling to their jobs, for obvious reasons, because they had no other way of supporting themselves. And this provided important jobs for unemployed young people. The head of the Texas National Youth Administration was a young Lyndon Johnson. Who was deeply inspired by FDR and the New Deal, and he became president of the United States in the 1960s and tried to expand even further on the New Deal by passing the Great Society. And we'll talk all about LBJ in the second semester. The Public Works Administration, the PWA, continued its work. They built the Lincoln Tunnel, the Grand Coulee Dam out west. They had a monumental, no pun intended, record of achievement in actually building things. Now, all of this was very, very expensive, and the government was running deficits throughout this time. Now, remember, FDR had always been skeptical of deficits, or at least concerned about deficits. But he basically embraced the central tenet of Keynesian economics by this point, that if there are three entities that can spend: business, individuals, and the government. And if individuals and business aren't spending or can't spend, then really the only entity left that can't spend to stimulate the economy is the government. And the government has an unlimited ability to spend money, right? Because it can always tax more, it can always borrow more. So if nobody else is doing it, the government has to be the spender of last resort, even if that means running a deficit. And FDR did that by this time and had come to terms with the whole idea. In fact, it embraced it. Now, the second New Deal was focused on the disadvantaged. Now, it was partly because of pressure from liberals, because some liberals were actually pushing FDR to go even bolder in terms of his New Deal legislation. It was partly for political reasons. FDR is looking to the 1936 election, and it was a man who was rising in prominence, who was to FDR's left, a senator from Louisiana named Huey Long, who was basically a populist demagogue. But Long actually, said that, we have to be a lot bolder and a lot more aggressive in actually providing assistance to the poor. So it was partly because of pressure from Long that FDR, decided to go even further left. The Resettlement Administration was created in 1935. Remember where I talked about how the AAA displaced sharecroppers and tenant farmers because of the way that a lot of farmers could earn their subsidies by growing less. Remember, the AAA tried to, stop overproduction. Farmers often just kicked out their tenant farmers and their sharecroppers off their land, leaving them in a much worse position. So the Resettlement Administration actually provided direct aid to these people, to tenant farmers and sharecroppers. The Rural Electrification Administration was created, which ultimately provided electricity for almost 50% of all rural areas. Before FDR came into office, only 10% of rural areas had electricity. Now, the AAA had been struck down as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, which we talked about in a previous, or I think the video yesterday. And he replaced the AAA with the Soil Conservation Act, which actually paid farmers to grow legumes instead of wheat and cotton. Which, remember, those two commodities were suffering from great price depreciation. So giving farmers an alternative to actually growing those crops. FDR made sure that there was an alternative there. Now, one of the most important legacies of the New Deal is that Roosevelt came down squarely on the side of unions and organized labor. Now, remember, organized labor unions are based on the principle of collective bargaining, right? If everybody negotiates together for better benefits, then you have a better chance of actually getting those things, as opposed to if I'm just going to my boss and ask for a raise, you could say, no, get lost, so go back to work. But if everybody does it together, then, in unity, there's strength. The more people that ask for improvement in the working conditions, the greater the chance of those actually being met. So unions help build the American middle class, and Franklin Roosevelt is the one who built up American unions. FDR wants you to join a union was actually a slogan that some union organizers used during this time to try to encourage more membership. Roosevelt's was really the first administration that was actually a pro-union administration. Remember, the government had been squarely on the side of corporate America for most of American history. Teddy Roosevelt, who was FDR's cousin, was neutral, and that was actually seen as an improvement, right? That he's not taking sides between workers and bosses, but he really wasn't pro-union. He was just said, I'm a neutral arbiter. Roosevelt was pro-union. And the thing is that the NRA, which it fortunately had been struck down as unconstitutional, but one of those restrictions or regulations they had for businesses that wanted to join was they had to protect workers' right to join a union if you wanted to join the NRA. But the NRA was struck down as unconstitutional. So Roosevelt wanted a permanent law that would apply to all American workers, not just companies that decide to opt into the NRA. And in 1935, a law was passed called the National Labor Relations Act, often called the Wagner Act, which is named after the sponsor, New York's own Senator Robert Wagner. And the Wagner Act is the most important piece of legislation ever passed to help organize labor. It guaranteed workers' rights to collective bargaining, saying you have the right to join a union, a legal right, all workers in the country. It permitted closed shops. Now, what a closed shop is that if you work in a certain factory or plant, you have to join the union. Conservatives hate this because they say, well, you shouldn't be forced to join a union if you don't want to. But the argument on the other side says, well, you benefit from the unions even if you don't want to be a member of it. The pay you get, the benefits you get are what the union negotiated for you. So if you don't join the union, then you're kind of just a free rider. It outlawed blacklisting because they used to write names of people who were union organizers, and it was very hard for these people to find jobs. That became a crime under the Wagner Act. They created the National Labor Relations Board in order to enforce the Wagner Act, which is still around to this day. So this is a complete reversal of Gilded Age policy. Where it was basically corporations could do no wrong, and unionization increased substantially to the point where by 1941 there were 8 million members of unions, and that continued after FDR. In the 1950s, a third of all American workers were actually members of unions. So unions helped create the American middle class, and again, FDR helped facilitate the growth of unions. Um, FDR also increased taxes pretty substantially on the wealthy and on corporations. You know, partly as an act of economic justice, but also because we needed money, right, to fund all these new programs. But conservatives didn't like that either because they said he's just soaking the rich. That's the argument they used. And he's a traitor to his class, because he's a fellow rich person. He's taxing the rich. But FDR, you had the argument. I'm going to actually play you this clip next week. But FDR actually embraced this, saying that, hey, if they don't, I'm on the side of the people. The rich people don't like me. I'm actually proud of that. Okay, I think I'm going to stop now because I want to talk about the next thing we're going to talk about Social Security. And Social Security does need a lot more discussion. I really want to do that live. So this is a briefer video than usual. So on our live class on Thursday, please make sure that you pay attention to our discussion about Social Security, and then we're going to be continuing live class and videos. I have to see whether next Wednesday, which is the 23rd, right for Christmas Eve, whether that's a video, an asynchronous day. I have to double check, but don't worry about that yet. All right, so I will see you all on Thursday. Peace.